Well, I am so pleased to have my guest, Father Ed Beck. Thank you so much for agreeing to join me, and welcome to Flip It on Its Head.
Thanks, Reese. It's good to be here.
Yeah, you and I have known each other for quite some time, and as an RC, as I like to refer to myself, as a Roman Catholic, I couldn't think of a better person to have a conversation with about where we find ourselves in this time. I've been referring to it as the gap between religion and faith. But before we do that, would you spend a little time sharing your journey and how, like, when you started seminary and how long you've been a Catholic priest?
Well, I never planned to go to seminary. I was actually working on Wall Street my first year of college, and kind of dissatisfied working there and feeling a little empty. And I'd made a retreat in high school, a forced retreat, which I didn't want to go on. And so they shipped 50 of us, me and my barbarian classmates, off to an island on the end of Long Island called Shelter Island. And there was a retreat house there, St. Gabriel's, that the Passionist community ran. And I was very impressed with what they did that weekend during the retreat, and with me and my classmates. And so that first year of college, when I was kind of questioning everything, I just called them up and I said, I had a really good experience in high school, and I'm wondering, if I could reconnect in some way. And they invited me back out. And I kind of just felt that same kind of peace and connectedness and meaning that I had felt, interestingly, in high school. And I knew that they had something that I wanted that I didn't have. And that really began my being more connected to them, and considering then joining the Passionist community, which is an order in the Roman Catholic Church. You've heard of Franciscans and Jesuits, Dominicans. Passionists are one more. So different from diocesan priests. And I decided that's what I wanted to do. And I transferred colleges my second year, and I lived with other students who were thinking about doing what I was doing, and with two Passionists and the students. And that really was the beginning of my quote unquote seminary training, which then went on to novitiate, a year in the monastery before I studied theology in Chicago.
Man, talk about a leap of faith. But whatever it is you discovered on that retreat must have really anchored something in you that a lot of people of deep faith either find or continue to search for. By the way, how long ago was that? How long have you been in the job?
Well, I took my first vows as a Passionist religious in 1981, and then I was ordained a priest in 1985. So I don't know the math on that, but it's like almost 40 years.
I was going to say it's just shy of 40. I think it's about 37 years. Man, you've been at it for a minute. So I wanted us to have a conversation about where a lot of people of faith find themselves, and really there's just more elbow room in the pews these days, because it seems like fewer and fewer people are committed to a particular religious practice. I'm mindful of reading something that I did share with you about how, and as of 2021, the number of religious nuns, people who don't, NONES, by the way, not the Catholic nuns, people who don't identify with any established religion in the U.S. has grown to nearly 30% of the population, and for Christians, it's down to 63%, down from 75% only a decade ago. First of all, is that your experience? Do you find that there are more people not associating with with any one of the major religions that we know existed, sort of Judeo-Christian set? And what has been your take on why you think that's happening?
Well, I think there's definitely been a decrease. You cannot deny the numbers, and not only in Roman Catholicism, but in institutional religion in general, as you mentioned. Maybe there's been some growth with some fundamentalist groups or evangelical groups, and that's an interesting phenomenon. But I think that there is a number of reasons for it. I think There's a suspicion of institutions in general right now in society, governmental institutions, societal ones, religious ones. And I think people have looked elsewhere for meaning other than institutional religion. And so I think we've seen kind of an uptick in yoga practices and meditation practices and people exploring various avenues of spirituality. Because I think that there's part of with the Roman Catholic Church and other religious traditions, I think the sex abuse scandal was really detrimental to religious institutions and the perception that this was hypocritical and more widespread than people ever thought. And I certainly know some people who walked away from the church in the midst of the sex abuse scandal. I think that people have more options today too and seek them out, interestingly, in a different way. I find people, as a result of social media, actually more isolated rather than more connected. And they seem to rely less on community, although it seems to me that what's needed is more community right now in the midst of that isolation. But I think all of those things have contributed to the illusion that we're more connected, but actually we're more isolated. And I think that has been evident in the lack of community participation in religion.
I'm so glad you touched on what should not be a taboo subject, and I do want to discuss the sex abuse scandals and as a Roman Catholic, why I didn't leave the church. You know, I have my own reasons, and I want to touch on that. But you mentioned the word community, and that was something that I was hoping we would touch on. By the way, the statistic that I shared was gotten from an Atlantic article written by Timothy Keller called "American Christianity is Due for a Revival." I will link to it in the notes. Part of what I have come to embrace with my Catholicism was the community, particularly that I had at my old parish in LA, where you and I met. You were on a retreat once, and you came and you served there, and I was a member of that parish for 20 years, St. Martin of Tours Church in Los Angeles, and I always loved how small and familial it was, and it was a source of real comfort to me, not just my practice, but the community that I had there, the friends that I made. I eventually ended up volunteering and participating as a lector in church, knowing the players as you do. Way back when, Father Ben came up to me and he said, "Reese, I need your participation. I need more young people in church." I said, "Ben, I'm not all that young, but I'll help out." It was the community that played such a big part in why I continue to maintain my relationship with the Catholic Church. And ironically, since moving just before COVID, I have not really connected to a parish. I've been doing a lot of mass online. I've been doing the live streams from St. Martin's, as well as some of the local parishes here, and I really have missed that.
What has prevented you from just seeking out the local parish there?
Honestly, at first it was just to protect myself during COVID, but when I did go to the closest parish here, it was so much bigger than the parish that I was used to, and I really just got intimidated by it. Now, Ash Wednesday was just last week, so for those of you listening, we are now in the beginning of the season of Lent. We just had the first Sunday of Lent. I did go to Mass during Ash Wednesday, and I felt the very thing that I'm mentioning to you, that I was just, I was in a room with other people, and I was moved by that. So I will be going to that parish and try to find a way to anchor to that community. What is in Scripture about the community that is given to us by our relationship to God, that people like me should remember, so that I don't fall into the trap of just watching Mass on YouTube when I really can and should become part of a community, despite the fact that I might be new to it?
Well, I mean, just what comes to mind is the words of Jesus, "Where two or three are gathered in my name, I am there present with them, and when the whole Eucharistic meal, the Last Supper, was instituted in the context of a community gathering, of a meal that was shared, take and eat, for this is my body. And when you do this together, you do it in remembrance of me. So it wasn't a solitary act, it was a communitarian act. And I think that all of Jesus' ministry certainly was based in a communitarian model, with the disciples, and then expanding that community. And then, of course, after Jesus, St. Paul and Titus and Timothy and all of those who were the great evangelists did the same. And so I think it's just been a real constitutive element of our faith from the very beginning, and Judaism as well, certainly. All the major religions have the communitarian aspect to them, because I think there's strength in numbers and there's support and there's discernment, when you can feel pretty isolated and getting in your own head too much and losing perspective. I think other people can be a touch base for you. The kind of structure of religion and of faith and of ritual that happens in the midst of community is also comforting, because it's familiar and it becomes a way to kind of blend yourself into the actions of what that community does and find meaning in them. So I think all of those reasons that there's really strength in numbers and there's solace that we find. And the individual stuff, I think the online masses, the Passionists have done a mass for over 50 years. So we started way before COVID, a TV mass that's broadcast nationally. And it was really for homebound people, people who were sick. And many more people found us during COVID as well. But it's always been very popular for homebound. But, you can't receive communion through the computer. You can't partake in the same way. And I think that there's just something that's irreplaceable when you gather in a space, a worship space with other people. That's a connectedness to God that, when God says, Jesus says, God is love, and the one who abides in love abides in God, and God in that person. I think that is communitarian. It's the love of brothers and sisters. It's the elbow rubbing of other people that make that enfleshed.
I took communion for the first time in a minute on Wednesday, and I had that, oh, right, feeling that came over me. It was soothing. How steep has been the climb back to the numbers, particularly like in your parish, because those are the people that you see on the regular, post COVID? Because obviously COVID affected so very many people for so very many different reasons, and the communitarian thing that you're talking about, we could not gather. And then I just got through telling you it wasn't just COVID. It was also because I left Los Angeles and came with my family to this small southern town. So I had both the need at the time to protect myself, just like everybody else did, but then also the bit where I had to find myself getting comfortable in a new environment. What are you seeing in your parish insofar as the numbers of people that have come back, and has it gotten back to where it was pre-COVID?
I would say that we are 80% back, and I don't think that we will see the other 20% again. I think people just found other ways and got into different rhythms and patterns in their life. And maybe 20% found that they didn't need it, or felt better without it, or just found what they were finding in community before elsewhere, a different kind of community. And I think that that's, if they found a home and they found that part of them that used to be fed and met in gathered worship, then fine. I hope that those 20% and whomever kind of went elsewhere after COVID just were able to find a place of connecting spiritually, if it's not in church, or certainly not in Roman Catholicism, then perhaps somewhere else.
so I do want to circle back because COVID was the thing we couldn't expect. But the thing that we were dealing with before that uh, was the sexual abuse scandal that absolutely rocked the Catholic Church. And this is something that my very dear friend Angela Poland, who happens to be, she's the director of the Catholic Academy of Bridgeport, Connecticut, but we've known each other for years, and we share our faith. And she and I determined, I mean, we had long conversations about, well, what are we going to do? And I told her straight up, I said, I feel like if you and I leave, then there are no voices for justice in our respective parishes, because we were outraged like a lot of Catholics. So I also feel like, if you're going to be a voice for what is righteous and what is true, no one's going to hear your voice unless you're in the room. But a lot of people did leave. Uh, how do you see how people reconciled the staying in the face of what was done, in our church, and also the people that left? I mean, you mentioned that you knew people who left, and you really can't blame them. But first of all, do you talk to people that still struggle with what the painful realities that were revealed, and do you still talk to people who have left, and where are they at?
Yeah, thanks for talking about this, Reese. It's a very complex issue. And as you know, I've also worked in the media for many years, in the mainstream media. And so during all of that, I needed to go on television and to talk about this and try to give some contextualization and some commentary on it. And so I've had to kind of do my research, and I've gotten asked the tough questions about it. And here's what I'll say: sexual abuse has always been present in institutions. Most sexual abuse happens in families. That's across the board, and that has been for quite some time. Sports, very high. We've seen various organizations like Boy Scouts, very high. Schools with teachers, very high. And a lot of that along the way was kind of surfaced in a public way, so that when that was happening, with coaches, although some of that was certainly latent, and we found out about some real egregious cases like University of Michigan, Penn State, et cetera. But I think what was surprising to people is that it had existed in the church and wasn't talked about. And when it was discovered, it was covered up, or it wasn't dealt with adequately. And priests were transferred elsewhere, even when they were known to be abusers, and continued to abuse. Now again, statistically, we're talking about 4% of Roman Catholic priests, which means 96% were not abusers. But those 4%, and again, that 4% is lower than some of those other institutions that I mentioned to you. But I think what was so horrifying to people is that, first of all, you expect more of the church, and should, right? And these were men, for the most part, who had vowed chastity or promised celibacy, who obviously were breaking those vows as well, to say nothing of the criminality of what was occurring. But I think what most kind of affected people was that they didn't know, and the cover up of it, especially by bishops and the hierarchy. And again, I think for many years, people did not have to deal with it. It used to be in the 70s, when this stuff was reported in religious communities and guys were sent away to treatment centers, they were given a clean bill of health, like they could return to ministry, by the treatment centers, who said pedophilia was actually curable and that they weren't a threat anymore. Well, we know now, 40 years later, that's not true. Pedophilia is not curable, and someone can never be put back into ministry again. And so it wasn't until after Boston and the Boston Globe reporting in 2002, when people saw the scope of it, and in fact, what had been covered up, that I think began this unraveling of trust in the institution, and especially in religious institutions, that they could have done such a thing. I mean, people would think, well, in sports or in school, or certainly they know in families, it has not been talked about, but people knew it had been present. But I think that's what really got people about the church stuff, and it seems so hypocritical, where a place is supposed to be a place of sanctuary and of comfort and of healing, when in fact there were members of that institution that were doing just the opposite. And yet again, I think after 2002 and with zero tolerance, that really shifted in the church, mandated reporting, all of that, began to happen. And yet the perception still was, as late as 2018, you'll remember the Pennsylvania grand jury report that came out, and 5 dioceses in Pennsylvania, over 300 priests, in that report. But what didn't get reported, and I was very conscious of it because I had to opine on it, was that more than half of them were dead. They were all old cases. Those that were alive, the statute of limitations had expired. They couldn't be prosecuted. And out of those 300 priests, only 2 could be prosecuted, and both were turned in by their own bishops. But that kind of got buried in the headlines. So again, that's not excusing any of it, but I think the perception was, after that Pennsylvania grand jury report, look, nothing's changed since Boston. It's still happening. When that wasn't the case. Again, it had changed since Boston, but those cases were never revealed. It was the first time the Pennsylvania diocese released those names. And so again, it kind of pulls the Band-Aid off the wound, a wound that continues to fester. And as other dioceses did that and released names that were previously not released or hidden, I think that just kind of continued to perpetuate this perception that this was, and it is a problem, but that it was a bigger problem than actually the numbers would have suggested. And the way the media approached it, I think, just did not help. All that to say, it's again, to put it into some context, it's not an excuse for it, but I think that living as a priest and working in the media, it was interesting to see both sides of what was happening there and why it was happening.
I remember the Pennsylvania grand jury report, and I remember feeling like, oh no, not again. And then again, as someone that continues to go to church and will maintain my my relationship to God through the Catholic Church, I wanted to know. And as I read more about it, one of my first things was, oh, most of these guys are dead. It's funny that you said it, because that's what I thought, despite the fact that I was sickened by it. And the other thought I had was, see, this is why the transparency is so important, because now we're going back years and uncovering all these terrible things that, had there been a system in place to truly deal with and do everything to prevent that sort of abuse from happening, well, then this this mountain of evidence wouldn't continue to be uncovered. And yes, I'm glad you've said twice that this is not an excuse for any of that monstrous behavior. It's an explanation of why the information trickles out. But you said, look, 4% of priests were responsible for what happened. And, when I hear that, I think, yeah, and the 4% are the reason why we can't have nice things. Like, that's all it takes for someone to start questioning, all right, well, then what am I sticking around for? But like I said, it was important for me. I'll be frank with you. Angela and I felt like if we don't stick around, then because we knew we sat in pews next to old guard Catholics who would just be apologists for the, well, crowd. And that infuriated me. And I felt like I've got to be a voice for something that rivals, justice and truth. And I can't do it if I bow out. So how does staying after the revealing of all this monstrous stuff, the revealing of the scandals, how does it make us better?
Well, I think, again, for people like you who stayed because you needed to fight for something that you believed in with regards to faith, and that this was not acceptable in the institution that you were baptized and confirmed in and that you believed in. I think that that's not only admirable, but necessary, because the church is more than those 4% of priests, and the church is the people of God, and it is the community of faith. And to deny oneself the Eucharist because of, what happened, I think is just not to really deal with the real issue. And that we needed people to stick around and deal with the real issue and get angry about it and talk about it and hold people to accountability. I mean, if it wasn't people like you holding people to accountability, then, a lot of it wouldn't have happened. So I think people who didn't give up and who did fight and claim their church, I think, was part of the reason why the issue began to be dealt with in a more transparent way.
And any organization is going to have to deal with, corruption of some sort. But when it affects children, it is so visceral. And I got through telling you how Father Ben at my old parish, he really had to lean on me to volunteer to be a lector. I tell you, he did not have to ask twice when it came to, we need someone to work with the first year confirmation class. Like, that's where I knew I could plug myself in and be in a room. I want to give credit to Susanna Nieto at St. Martin of Tours, who is one of the lay people that also leads the young people through confirmation class. I had a conversation with her and I said, I will do this if we can be frank about reminding the children that that's their body. If anyone, does anything untoward, they have every right to say, that they're uncomfortable. Like, we labored to create an environment where this is it. This is where the rubber meets the road. And if I'm going to stay, then I'm going to open my big mouth and make sure that the young people that we are, in the pews next to with their families know that they have a voice too, and that they can and should feel comfortable saying when they're not comfortable.
Most definitely. I couldn't agree with you more.
So growing the church is also something that, that the article that I mentioned talked about. And here's where I wanted to get your take, because I'm not a big proselytizer. I tell people that my way of saying it is like, look, I go to church. It works for me. I love Jesus Christ. I'm not super Christy about sharing it with other people, though. I was comforted by reading Matthew last week, and how don't be like the hypocrites. So my experience has always been personal to me. My relationship with God is personal. So I'm not a big proselytizer. But if we're meant to grow the church, if we're meant to create an environment where other people can join and be next to us in the pews, what do you tell people about doing their part to make others welcome in our faith?
Well, again, as we mentioned before, Christianity and Catholicism are not individualistic religions. They are communitarian. And Jesus said, go and baptize in the name of the Father and the Son. He sent the disciples out. They were missioned. So that is the starting point. So we are, in fact, baptized into a mission. Now, proselytizing has a negative connotation, as if you're trying to convert people, where you're going to kind of ram your religion or your beliefs down their throat. I think there's a way of proselytizing by the way you live and how you live and what you testify to, and not being afraid to do that in front of other people or to other people. I think that's how the church grows, when people, see how they love one another, and people are intrigued by where does that come from, or how do they do that, or what's the source of that power. That's its own proselytizing, I think. And I think really that witness is what Jesus was talking about, that they're going to know something's different about you by how you live and how you treat one another and how you love one another. And so that's the greatest witness I think we can give. And I think when people see and know the source of that, then that is its own way of bringing people to the good news. and to the faith. And so I think it's a both and. I think you don't hit people over the head with it, but I don't think you can put it under a bushel basket either. It's not just about me and God. It never has been from the very beginning.
I try to remember that we are meant to love one another as Christ would have us love one another. And I've mentioned this to my kids. It's like, look, you know, God says we have to love our brothers and sisters. He didn't say we have to like them, right? I don't have to start a bowling team with everybody, but I do have to love them as Christ would have me love them. And that's what I try to live. I try to be that example to my kids, and but mostly because it's soothing to me,
Mm-hmm.
right? And if it happens to be an example for others, okay. And if you want to know more, come on down. But it's not going to change how I feel about you if you don't. I'll tell you something that I have struggled with in my own faith. That the tenets of our faith are used to form legislation that governs the lives of others, and that might hold sway over people that don't subscribe to our faith. And I'm thinking mostly about issues around climate change and women's reproductive rights. These are difficult issues to navigate, and a lot of times people will rely on their faith for how to proceed. But I have personally struggled with Christians talking about positions and how laws should be made to govern that, when I know that I have friends that, they're Jews, they're Muslims, look, they're agnostics and atheists. So tell me as a Catholic what I can do about my questioning of that, and how do you counsel people who struggle with their faith and these very important and worldly issues that matter to a lot of people?
Well, I think that it's a mistake to think that we can totally separate ourselves from the body politic or from polis. I think that we're political by nature. Pope Francis has a great quote that he thinks we should be political and that we should be involved in, fight for justice when that enters the political arena. Now, that's different from being partisan. It's recognizing that some important decisions and choices get made by legislators that affect people's lives and that affect our lives. And so to totally divorce oneself from it and to say that religion should have no influence in that sphere, I think is unrealistic. And I don't think that's true. It's never been the case. I think that separation of church and state as a constitutional reality is to be respected. I mean, the whole point of that was kind of to protect both. But I think that if you're really true about living the gospel, then matters of justice and certain life matters need to be addressed as a person of faith. Now, that doesn't mean, again, I don't think that you demand everyone think the same way that you do on certain issues. But I think the problem with certain life issues, like capital punishment, like abortion, like euthanasia, is that if you believe in the sanctity of life, and if you have an understanding that that is conception until natural death, then it's really hard to say you're not going to fight for that in the political arena, because it seems very basic, to one's perspective of faith. And so I think that, I mean, they're different issues from climate change, I think. But in the same way that you can say across the board, this can be someone's perspective, I think that murder is not only immoral, but it needs to be illegal. That no one should, well, many people's perception of abortion would be that it's a type of murder. It's a killing of the innocent. So therefore it needs to be illegal, just like any kind of murder is illegal. Now, again, is that just one's perspective that's inflicted upon somebody else? Well, can you say the same thing then about murder if that's your perspective? So I think it gets a little bit dicey, which is why I think that there's such a break around some of these life issues, even within the church. I think that the majority of Catholics polled think that there should be a choice, especially if you're talking about extreme examples of rape and incest. I think most Catholics support, Roe v. Wade. Now, that doesn't mean officially the Catholic Church, for what it teaches, is in agreement with that. And so you have this kind of dissonance with what the faithful seem to adhere to and believe and what the teaching is. And you say, well, why is the teaching this? What is the teaching trying to say by it? And why is there this disconnect? I think that's where the conversation happens. That's where we have the questions, well, when does life begin? Does it really begin at conception? And many scientists, it's not many people of faith who think that. Many scientists say that that's when they believe it begins at conception. So if it does begin at conception, and there are two heartbeats, then there are two lives. Now, the fact that one of those lives is literally encased in another's body, how does that change the conversation? How does that change the rights? And again, people have varying perspectives on that. But that's, I think, where the complexity begins to come in some of these issues, because people don't see it as simply separation of church and state. They see that some of these issues, you can't separate it because they're moral, ethical life issues that go beyond any kind of separation that can be imposed.
Yeah, difficult questions that, when we try to find the answers, that people like you and me, we rely on not just the information, but our faith to help guide us towards what we believe will be just and what we can live with ourselves. Another area that and it's an issue that gets demagogued, and I wished it didn't, in regards to refugees and refugee resettlement. What you do for the least of my children, you do for me. And the issue of people running for their lives has been turned on its head, not the way that I'm talking about here, but in a way that really demonizes people that are at their weakest moment. The church's perspective is pretty clear on refugees. If someone is seeking shelter and to be free from harm, you take them in. How are you seeing that topic being handled right now, and what do you believe we could be doing more of to really get the stigma around this to not be quite so heated?
Well, again, I'm very proud of the position of the Catholic Church with regards to immigration and what the bishops have said and literally done with regards immigration and illegal immigrants in particular, giving shelter and sanctuary, and believing that, again, the legislation needs to be changed to address some of the inequity and some of the barbarism with regards illegal immigration. Now, it's interesting that some of those same people who think that the church should not be involved in politics think, well, it's okay to be involved there. We pick and choose our issues of, what laws are unjust or what laws should be addressed, or the Czech Catholic Church or other churches should be speaking up about. But certainly immigration is one that, and capital punishment. I mean, the Pope has said under no circumstances now is capital punishment acceptable, no matter what. So, you have someone like Governor DeSantis, who just, presided over an execution in Florida, who claims to be Catholic. So you can say, well, as governor, he's representing his state. And does that mean that he believes capital punishment is okay? Is it acceptable then for a Catholic, such as Governor DeSantis, to say that capital punishment is okay and then to actually preside over a killing? And so I think that, getting back to your issue of immigration, I think that what we're seeing is that people realize the system is broken. And I think that everyone is for legislation reform, I think, with regard to immigrants. I just think that there's a real disconnect or real disparity about what people believe that should be. And I think that the church is a voice that if people are seeking refuge, and especially from oppression or from unjust or unlivable conditions, that they need to be welcomed and they need to find a place and a home, and that we have to make that somehow possible. Now, there are others who don't believe that, who just think that it's draining on Americans, the American economy, and we've taken enough people and we can't afford to take any more, and we just can't do it. And so, again, that's where the conversation happens about what do people perceive as just, equitable, and necessary. And I think faith does enter the conversation because they're life issues.
It's funny how you mentioned immigration reform is something that needs to happen, because people have screamed how America's done enough and we're running out of resources. The irony is the very thing that will eventually continue to make us a strong and thriving democracy will be immigration because of low birth rates. Quite frankly, we're going to run out of people to do jobs that need to be done. And immigration is the thing that's going to give us the workforce that we'll need. But also, strangely, those immigration patterns have also been filling the church. A great many people that migrate from Africa and Central and South America specifically are Christians and Catholics. So, what have you been seeing, particularly in your parish, insofar as the disparate numbers of immigrants that are part of your particular parish, and as you may see in parishes across the country, which I know you get around, and you've been to a few different parishes.
Yeah, well, the parish that I'm currently working in is on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, so it's kind of, well, while it's a diverse group, it wouldn't be a group that sees an awful lot of newly arrived immigrants, I don't think. However, I live in New York City, and we certainly see it in the Archdiocese of New York and in dioceses throughout the country. And you're right that while numbers are down, numbers, especially Spanish-speaking numbers, are up and are increasing. And, Spanish-speaking people make up more than 50% now of Roman Catholics in the United States. And so it is, in fact, I think, necessary that the Catholic Church, especially in the States, talks about, well, how is that changing how we minister? And, it's really becoming a requirement that newly ordained also speak Spanish and study Spanish so they'll be able to minister to more than half of the population in the United States right now. And it's all around the world. The face of Roman Catholicism certainly is changing and is shifting to the Southern Hemisphere. I mean, Africa is bursting at the seams with Catholics. And in just a matter of decades, actually, Christianity has grown, across the board in Indonesia, in Asia, in the Philippines. Of course, Catholicism is very strong. So these are the places where Catholicism is emerging as a real force, while it continues its descent in Western Europe and the United States. That's not true all around the world, and sometimes we can lose perspective on that. And we're seeing some of those people, which gets us to the immigration, entering the United States as Roman Catholics. We're seeking a place of worship. And I think we have to be really prepared to change as a result of that. That is, we don't just ask people to do it our way. and the way we've become accustomed to, but how do we change as a result of them now being part of us? And again, that we've seen bilingual services, we've seen, masses certainly in Spanish to accommodate Spanish-speaking communities, etc. But I think it's more than just saying a mass in Spanish. It's culturally, it's societally, it's how we look at the church. They bring different traditions, they bring different histories, different experiences of God, different expressions of prayer, and some of which are indeed literally foreign to us. But are we open to them? Are we open to learning from them? As we have, I think, with African Americans and Black Catholics, still a minority in the Catholic Church, maybe 3 or 4%. But, I think we have a great respect for that history of gospel music, of the liturgy that Black Catholics celebrate and what it says to us. And when you go to a mass in the African American community, how transforming it can be. And I have a privilege to work in the African American community in Chicago and in Harlem here in New York. And some of my most satisfying experiences of ministry were as part of those communities, because they were so able to express, their faith and to lift themselves up in prayer in a way that, I didn't find in a lot of white churches growing up or ministering even as a priest. And so I think there's something really to be learned from various cultures that we have to allow to infiltrate our experience.
You're talking about a diversity of thought and diversity of faith. When you create an environment where diverse people can become a part of a group or a system, they will bring new systems of thought that are not present in a homogeneous environment. Well, for us as Catholics, it's also a diversity of faith, which is, I think, what you were just describing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and again, it may be, it's the same Roman Catholic faith, but the way it gets embodied and expressed is distinctive and can almost seem foreign, as I said, to us. But that doesn't mean it's not as valid an expression of what Roman Catholicism is.
That one hits close to home, because I don't think I ever told you how I wound up a Catholic. So I'm a first generation American. I was born in New York City. I was born in Elmhurst Hospital in Queens, New York. And my mom is from Bogota, Colombia. She's a Latina Catholic. My father was from Tehran, Iran. And he was a lapsed Muslim. He was not unlike the people that I think we've in part been talking about, the people who they had a faith, but they either tired of a practice. My dad was not at all interested in the practices of Islam. As a matter of fact, he once told me that the imams where he grew up, he felt like they were all scam artists, because he would watch my grandmother tithe, and he did not like that. So when he met my mother and they decided they were going to get married and have a family, he said, "Take him to church. I don't care." So I'm the product of a lapsed Muslim and a Latina Catholic. I grew up in a Jewish neighborhood in Queens, New York, with kids who were also Sikhs and Hindus. Like, I had a pretty ecumenical upbringing.
Yeah.
But it really did, it strengthened my faith, because I always believed, all right, well, there are a lot of ways to recognize and love God. This one just happens to be mine. And it left room for the diversity of expression of faith that we were talking about.
Yeah, and it's great that you've had that experience. I mean, interreligious kind of experience in family with your own parents, and then neighborhood wise, and being able to make those kind of comparisons and still be able to see something distinctive about what you are attracted to and why. That's a rich experience. And I think the more people have those experiences, the deeper and more profound the faith is.
I learned how to say the Hebrew prayer over bread and wine, because in middle school, I actually played Jesus Christ in Godspell. So I had to learn how to do that. And my Jewish friends' moms loved that. I got invited to more than one Passover dinner, I'll tell you, Ed, because
I'm sure.
I
I'm
knew how to
sure.
drop that Baruch Atah Adonai right when they needed it.
That's great, Reese. That's great.
I listen. I'm a blessed guy for a lot of reasons, man. I wanted to start having conversations on Flip It on its head, because so much of the good that has come in my life has come from being able to look at things differently. And one of the things that I have looked at differently has been my faith, and especially at a very trying time when I could very well have kind of packed it in. I don't feel
Mm.
like I deserve any extra credit for finding the faith and the fortitude to stick through it. I feel like I'm getting more out of finding my path forward, despite the terrible trouble that our church saw, and the people who suffered because of it. But I certainly appreciate that, as a leader in the church, that you have left space for people to have their own experience of faith and God, and that if they want to, they can come back, but you're still going to pray for them regardless.
Yeah, most definitely. And I'm glad to hear too when you say that you went Ash Wednesday and there was something about being reconnected and receiving communion that felt right and that you missed. And I hope that you can continue that search. I mean, continue if it's not that parish or it's going to be another parish or wherever, but that sense of being connected in community that you've begun to kind of realize is missing in some way, that you pay attention to that and that we all pay attention to it.
Yeah. And I just need to look at it a little different. That's all.
Yeah.
So Ed, I'm dying to know what are you psyched about? What's on your radar right now that is taking up space and doing so in a really great way?
Well, I'm working on a new play, and we've had two public readings here in New York City, and we have a producer who is moving forward as lead producer to get a production of the play. We're going to have a reading in Los Angeles in May to get some television film people on board. And then we're looking to have an out-of-town tryout of the play and then bring it into New York on off-Broadway or Broadway.
This is exciting. This is something I've known about you, but for everyone listening, Ed also happens to be a playwright.
Yep.
So this is a new work?
Yes. Yeah, it is. And it's called Ungodly Pursuit. And I began it the week the Pennsylvania Grand Jury Report came out in 2018. And it, in an ancillary way, that's kind of the jumping off point for the play. Mm. And I'm really excited that it's gotten this far and there's so much interest in it. And it's, for me, it's another way to, not in a heavy-handed way, but to preach the gospel. I mean, people go to a theater who will never enter a church. Mm. And if I can say something in a play that I think is important, that maybe I'll never get to preach to them in a pew or, in a church, but perhaps they'll hear it in a theater and be moved by a dramatization of something that resonates with them. I think that's part of what I'm called to do. And so I'm really appreciative to have that other avenue now afforded to me and to be able to work in that space.
I always say, write what you know, huh?
That's it.
Good for you, man. And I am very excited to see what becomes of your hard work. I will buy a ticket, man. Just let me know when and where.
I'll do so.
And
I will.
And as someone who's well versed in the Bible, I'll tell you, whenever I did the readings at St. Martin's, and I would, I would process out with Father Donny or Father Ben, and we'd stand out there, and the other parishioners would walk out, and these are people I knew for years. They always say, "Oh, Reese, you read so well." I always said the same thing: it's good writing.
It's good. I like it.
Thanks. And Ed, I can't thank you enough for being here and for sharing your very valuable perspective on a way for all of us, but particularly me, to continue to look at my faith. It matters a lot. So thank you.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me, Reese. It's been a pleasure, and good luck with the podcast. I look forward to more.
Thanks.